to each of you on the panel. Sanjiv, Bajaj, it is a complex world and it is getting more challenging as we speak. There are, of course, issues, geopolitical issues. There are geopolitical flashpoints, tensions at this point in time. What we're also seeing at the same time is that countries like India have the aspiration of resilience. Atmanirbhar Bharat is our standpoint from which we want to take our Make in India vision forward. We are, of course, seeing this de-risking as supply chains go taking place. The assumption through the COVID pandemic was that there would be a decoupling with China, for instance. That clearly is not the case. What we are seeing more today is a de-risking. As we reshape global supply chains, as we move into an era of re-globalization, what do you believe is the advantage that India enjoys today? But what do you also believe we need to be mindful of in terms of the assumptions that we are making?
Shereen, such a long question. I've forgotten the first part of it. But let me start off by saying that, my one way to sense how the economy is going is to look at the color of Shereen's clothes. So if we are in the purple of health, I'm waiting for her pink suit to come out soon. The opportunity that we have, and as Dr. Jaishankar has said, is leveraging the capability of our youth, our entrepreneurship. If you look at the book, it talks about 25% of world GDP. What was that? That was entrepreneurship. So we have a chance to re-leverage that, as we have seen in the last 15 years. I think one very significant difference in the last 15 years has been the availability of capital. Otherwise, capital was only available with large groups. You had to wait for months outside a banker's branch to get access to capital. I think that's where the alternate sources of capital have also made a very big difference, and you can see that with Startup of India. So I think entrepreneurship, manufacturing, very clearly, a significant focus on R&D. See, most of what we manufacture today has been invented in the West. But we are seeing a fundamental change which happens, I think, globally only periodically, which is what the digitalization is doing, what green and sustainability is doing. This will create new industries. We're already seeing that in the digital world. See what UPI has done. There is no reason that innovation for these new sectors should happen in the West. Countries like India should lead that. But how do you do it? I think industry-academia partnership, really focusing on research which can be implemented, upgrading skills in the government institutions, private institutions, very important. So right now I would stick to these three.
Okay, and I'm glad that you brought up the R&D issue, because this academia-industry partnership I've heard for very, very long, and we seem to be stuck at exactly the same position that we were several years ago. And this is something that Mr. Kant draws up in the book as well, and I'm going to sort of get each one of you to comment on that. In his opening address, Mr. Kant did talk about the fact that if India has to become part of the global supply chain, then we need to look outwards much more. Indian companies need to be global champions, not just domestic champions. We need to do more to build global champions. R&D. He says in the book, this is one area where Indian firms and entrepreneurs have traditionally lagged behind. Even now, more global companies conduct R&D in India than domestic companies. For instance, India's R&D expenditure as a percentage of GDP stood at 0.6% in 2018. In contrast, South Korea's R&D expenditure was at 4.5% of GDP, China at 2.1%. TV Narendran, every time we talk about what will the private sector do to try and up R&D investments, it comes back to what is it in it for industry as far as tax SOPs are concerned. Are we now closer to exiting that mindset? Is there a shift in approach and thinking from the private sector to really move up the value chain, so to speak?
I think we've... Can you hear me? Yeah. I think, that was certainly one of the asks at some point in time. But yes, we certainly need to do a lot more. But I think when you look at it, while we've been talking of industry-academia partnership, if you really look at countries which have done well, there actually exists an ecosystem which translates research in the lab to pilot to scale. And I think there's typically a value of death, which in technology terms you call TRL 4 to 6, which is technology readiness level 4 to 6. Typically, academic institutions take it from 1 to 4. And industry takes it from 6 to 9 or 10. This 4 to 6 is the place where it falls. It's not scaled up, it falls between the lab and the market. And I think that's where, if you look at many countries, they bridge that gap very well. And I think we need to do that. Even in India, for instance, very few companies in the private sector work with the CSIR labs. And they have some fantastic capabilities. They have fantastic labs, fantastic people, great ideas. And I think there needs to be a lot more done. Industry needs to invest, which it happens, let's say, in auto, happens in pharma, happens in some areas. It doesn't happen across all sectors. And certainly we need to plug this gap between academia and industry, which I think some companies are doing. There's a lot more that we need to do.
But building global champions, I mean, are we closer to that inflection point of taking more, share of global value?
Yeah, I think we are. You know, if you look at it, I mean, traditionally we compare to the Japanese and the Koreans or the Taiwanese. A lot of them have built brands globally.
Yeah.
But if you really look at it, it's auto or, appliances, etc. In India, we've built great global brands and services. And I think if you look at whether it's TCS or Infosys or Wipro, HCL or Cognizant or whatever, I think they are global brands. They're in the services space. We need to do more. There's the great work done by the pharma companies. There's great work done by the auto component companies. So I think there are good examples. We need to do a lot more of it. I think Indian corporates, particularly in the B2B space, are probably better known than in the B2C space globally.
Yeah, and that is an area of opportunity, but also a big challenge at this point in time. Mallika, Srinivasan, I want to pick up on the ecosystem aspect that we just heard there from TV Narendran. And one sector which has actually done that quite successfully and has done it over the last several decades has been the auto sector. This ecosystem effect has played out. We've seen global champions emerge. We've also seen a very robust small and medium enterprise ecosystem emerge on the back of that. How do we replicate that for sunrise sectors that Mr. Kant has articulated in the book that could drive innovation and could drive India forward?
I'd like to comment and picking up from where Naren left off on innovation. Newer models are coming. I realized, Shereen, that we've been talking about industry-academia interface for long, but I think we're beginning to crack it. We're beginning to crack it if you look at the IIT Madras example, if you see the work that Professor Jujunwala has done. And I think a lot of us are setting up research centers, centers of excellence within academic institutions aimed at bridging this gap. So we're making some progress in that area. I think the other thing is that it was interesting to read in the Wall Street Journal yesterday, which said China finally finds its rival, and I'm quoting this, for being the global factory floor in the global search for China +1 was what it carried. So I think today the world's confidence in India as a manufacturing location is high. Indian entrepreneurs' confidence in being able to manage global companies, either growing organically through subsidiary routes or growing through an M&A route, is very high. And in all this, I think there's a growing awareness that what can really make the difference is perhaps two things. One is R&D and innovation, and with the advance in technologies, deep tech, AI and blockchain, the dimensions of competition itself are going to change. What is going to be a competitive differentiator is going to be dramatically different, and we need to establish the enterprise. This is our opportunity. We have strengths in digital, we have a good tech stack, we have it going for us, and this deep tech needs to be absorbed by not just the startup ecosystem, but by established industry to innovate new models, new products, and new approaches to business. And I think we have a lot of confidence at this point that it can be done.
There is confidence domestically. There is confidence that foreign investors are now showing much more in India as well in the context of the changes that we are seeing, Nana. But let's talk about the other C, and that is competitiveness. And going back to what Mr. Jaishankar said, that let's not go around looking for the China fix of efficiency. It ain't going to happen. So what is going to be the India competitive differentiator that we must leverage?
So Shereen, first let me just start by saying it's wonderful to be celebrating a book and a guy who unashamedly, unabashedly is for business. I mean, in my 35 years in business, it has been many decades and years where business is always in a corner and in a spot. And I think to celebrate the successes of business and to look at what business needs, there was no better champion than Amitabh here, who was someone who heard, who listened, and who was fearless in trying to sort the issue out. And that brings me to what does it take for us to succeed? We cannot just be, and China did succeed somewhat in feeding its domestic market, but its real growth came from export. we need to export. And in order to export, as you rightly said, we need to be competitive. And how are we going to be competitive when the factors of production are not competitive? Interest rates. Banks subsidize 40% priority sector lending is a subsidy to a huge bunch of sectors. Now, I'm not here to deliberate right or wrong, but our model today is that business subsidizes what government should be doing, and we would be better off giving that money directly to those who need it than forcing industry to do it. Energy costs. It's free to consumers, to agriculture. Industry pays a premium. So as long as the factors of production make us uncompetitive in an ecosystem, let's not dream about being export and competitive. And it is no surprise that we have succeeded in sectors that don't need high power costs, that had skills, therefore the services sector. So to succeed in manufacturing, we have to be competitive for the export markets. And I think that is what we are seeing in terms of the government recognizing. But subsidizing industry isn't going to be the answer either, because then those subsidies have to run off. We do not need an industry that goes back to what we were 25 years ago, inefficient and incapable of standing on its own feet. So subsidies for 5 years, yes, to help it going, but we have to be competitive in the long run. And this will stand in the way of foreign industry coming here as well. Or we will end up continuing to be, and which is also good, a service exporter. So let's celebrate that success. And by the way, there's a danger here that we ignore some of that. I was very interested to see that in our IT exports, the other IT is growing faster than our traditional big companies. And what is that other IT made up? It's made up of global, the GCCs, the kinds of things that I was overseeing at HSBC, where you have these centers, 1,600 of them in this country, MNCs setting up here to have these production centers, which are doing R&D, which are doing engineering, and exporting that. So let's encourage what is working. Let's encourage those that come in. Let's not ignore the service sector, even as we look to fix what manufacturing requires for exports.
Oh, absolutely. I agree with you that these two have to happen in parallel. And you're absolutely right to Mr. Jaishankar's point that we need to also think in India. I think a lot of the work on the think in India, the design in India, is going on in those global centers that are focused here on R&D. But Mr. Kant, let's address what we've heard from the panel so far and what we also heard from Mr. Jaishankar. If you were to prioritize what reforms are now needed as we look ahead for the next 25 years. You've identified sunrise sectors, whether it's the mobility revolution, battery storage, and so on and so forth, as things that India must focus on, sectors that India must focus on. But if there were to be enabling changes that the government puts in place, because that's what you believe the role of the government is, and the role of the private sector is to actually deliver, what is it that you believe the government now needs to focus on?
Shereen, I'm a great believer that you need 10 Indian states. You know, we are a very large country. We are bigger than 24 countries of Europe. So you need, you know, Gujarat has grown, Maharashtra has grown, but you need many countries in the eastern part of India now to accelerate the pace of growth and bring in reforms. So if you have Bihar, UP, Chhattisgarh, Madhya Pradesh, all of them, Rajasthan, they grow at about 10% plus for the next 2.5 decades. India is bound to grow. So the real reform, now the center has brought in GST, it brought in IBC, it brought in RERA, it really pushed for digital transformation. I mean, between 2015 and 2017, we brought in 500 million bank accounts. Now, 55% of the bank accounts were opened in India. We do 11x of payments or fast payments than what Europe and America does. We do 4x of what China does. So central government has done its bit. It's now for the states to accelerate the pace of growth. If you have 10 state champions, India is bound to grow. There's no way India can be held back. And states need to bring in ease of doing business. They need to bring in radical reforms. They need to bring in private sector. They need to really transform themselves.
Okay, So basically you're saying the battle now needs to move to individual states, and individual states need to pick up the pace on that. But as industry, you know, I want to get into that issue with you. We keep talking about this business about the central government has done its bit as far as reforms are concerned. The actual execution comes down to state governments. Has it gotten easier? Is it getting more challenging in being able to bridge the two? Mallika, Srinivasan.
No, yes, it is certainly easier to do business. I think my trips to Delhi are less than what they used to be. Perhaps for PESB a little bit more now, but otherwise less. So certainly we can visibly see the difference. But I was going to add a comment to what Amitabh said on the areas for the future. This government is all about inclusive growth. Inclusive growth, and in this whole area, I think one area I want to draw attention to is in diversity and inclusion of women, be it in the workforce, the participation in the workforce, or as entrepreneurs, or as startup founders. Amitabh refers to that in his book. Yet, that is true, we do see more women as startup founders, but yet the participation in the workforce by any standards is quite low. It's quite low, 32% we're talking about, including everyone. And if you see the global average, you're talking about a little over 52%, and East Asia is 66%. So I think if in our way forward, for good economic growth, we would need to set an agenda for bringing women in a much larger way into the workforce.
And why do you think that that's not happening? Because we have pretty progressive policies on paper. What do you think is not working on the ground? Why are we seeing a decline in labor force participation specifically?
I think it goes beyond just putting in policies for women to participate in the workforce. I've thought about this subject and I said, why is this not happening? I think it went down in 2018. What was the issue? I think there's a larger agenda in terms of a social and cultural change. I can see a lot of women nodding in the room when I say social and cultural change, because I think that's the ecosystem we need to change. And the answer to that perhaps lies in the economic empowerment of women. That's a good starting point. The economic empowerment of women is a great starting point to bring cultural and social change.
Nena, I want you to come in on that before we proceed further. But, you know, on this issue of bringing more women into the economy, formal, informal, access to capital, access to credit, women founders, you know, we do have, as I said, whether at the central level or the state government level or even at the corporate level, we have lots of policies in place to enable women to come into the workforce. Yet we've actually seen a decline year on year.
I think Mallika's captured it in terms of until the social system changes, where there are studies which show that maybe there's greater acceptance of allowing the woman to go into the workplace. So the economic empowerment and the benefits that accrue to the family. However, the requirements of her in the social context, she still has to be mother, daughter-in-law, aunt, grandmom, whatever, and manage the job. So until society's expectations of her role in society also change, and there is sharing, where our men begin to think of women as equals, this is not going to change. And I've seen it, whether it was working with Seva in Gujarat or with the women in our corporate world. It's the woman who shifts jobs, it's the woman who follows the guy by and large, it's the woman who takes off to bring up a child. And as long as society's expectations don't change, this doesn't change. But policies, yes, they're good. Many companies will tick the box, but whether the ecosystem has also shifted, whether in a company or otherwise, needs a good look. But having said this, I should say we get a huge tick mark in favor of what we're doing in microfinance. And the self-help group movement in this country has absolutely taken off. It is something which the world must replicate. And the economic empowerment that follows from lending into women's self-help groups as we make them more capable of running businesses. And this is beyond doing little tailoring and embroidery. We had women masons trained over Swachh Bharat mission who were building toilets. And Jharkhand achieved its targets only because they had over 1 million women masons who are now going on to do other masonry work as well. So we have this army of talent which can come available to us through galvanizing the self-help groups which are already organized thanks to the microfinance movement in the country.
Yes, and we have seen that play a positive role. But Mr. Kant, since we are talking about policy, I want to pick up on what we heard there from Mr. Jaishankar and address that issue, because I think it is a complex issue that people like you will need to grapple with in government and business as well. National priorities, and everyone's trying to focus on that. We have it here. Yesterday we heard from President Biden saying, I want to move supply chain back to America. On the other hand, what we are seeing is a consistent move in terms of hiking import duties here in India. The WTO has raised that as a concern with us now in specific areas like the telecom sector and the ICT sector. How do you balance this level playing field for the domestic industry while trying to draw in large strategic foreign direct investment as well?
So, Shereen, the point is that we need to be very productively efficient, and that is what this government is doing. If you're making 55,000 kilometers of road, you're making your ports efficient, you're making your road sector efficient, you're making your airlines more efficient. You need to become you've given yourself 4 to 5 years' time, because that's what the PLI is all about. The PLI says that you're going to grow bigger, 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 bigger in 5 years' time. That's your target. And you're going to become a major exporting nation. We are going to support you in terms of size and scale to become a global champion in 5 years. But 5 years, India must become more productively efficient than any other country in the world. That is what the government is doing through digital transformation, through direct benefit transfers, through building of infrastructure, through Gati Shakti, a whole range of schemes to transform India in terms of infrastructure and make India productively the most efficient economy in the world. And that is what will transform India as a manufacturing nation.
Speaking of productivity and speaking about efficiency as well, you also need perhaps agility as far as policy making is concerned. For instance, on the issue of China, to try and draw in the likes of Apple and Foxconn here into India, we have had to review the fact that you cannot have a Chinese joint venture partner here operating in India. Do you believe that that is also the need of the hour, that we cannot have this sort of black and white approach to these decisions, and we need to bring in agility and perhaps to some extent pragmatism as well as we try and draw in this supply chain, which is, as we've all talked about, this de-risking that's taking place?
So if you look around the entire Asian countries, each one of them, when they started manufacturing, they went down to later, subsequently to component manufacturing. And to my mind, component manufacturing is very critical. Now, as we get into component manufacturing, you bring in some international players, but over a period of time, what has happened? Look at Maruti. When Maruti came in, you had tier 2 producers, you had tier 3 producers, you had tier 4 producers. All of them have now become Indianized. All of them are Indian manufacturers. So over a period of time, all of them will be Indian companies. We don't need to worry about this. The important thing is to build good, large, efficient companies who will penetrate global markets. The more you do that, you will have MSMEs growing in India. That is how you will build up size and scale, but you will build up very efficient backward-forward linkages in the supply chain.
I want to address with each one of you, and Sanjiv, I'll start by asking you, how are you factoring in what is happening as far as geopolitical tensions are concerned into your business plans? For instance, if you had to do a tech transfer, or you had to do a technology tie-up, would you consider, the friends approach? We're now talking about the U.S. Treasury Secretary saying that, look, let's consider friend shoring, or let's consider near shoring. Are those now weighing much more on the minds of CEOs as they make business decisions on who to do business with, where to do business with, where to put your money, who to get your tech transfer done with?
So, Shereen, this will again vary by business. So, I'm in the financial services business. For us, the biggest driver is interest rates and inflation overseas, how they impact us. Just look at the last 2 days. With the US signaling a pause, at least for some time, in interest rates, our stock markets are up. And that impacts all of us that raise debt on the back of equity to build our business. What we are looking from the government, whether it's near-shoring, friend-shoring, enemy-shoring, is consistency of policy. Businesses are not built for a day. We build businesses for decades. So if we know that this is the road, we can choose how fast or slow to go on that road. But if the road is going to have curves in it which we can't see, that adds to risk. And if you add risk in business, automatically businessmen get more conservative. So to me, that's important. To us, fortunately, our business today is all domestic. The resilience of our economy, in which we have seen, and it has surprised some of us positively over the last few years, has meant that we have continued to grow, because the quality of growth in India is unparalleled right now, especially being in the consumer and SME lending and insurance sectors. Those have grown very well. You know, I keep hoping that we need to see India growing at 8, 9, 10%. And I think that's an opportunity that we are losing by not doing so. But when I look at India over the last 20 years, if you look at India in 5-year snapshots, we have changed dramatically as a country towards the positive. Now, we can do a lot more, but I do see that change. I'll also take a shot at something that you asked earlier. One, where it comes to women, when I see women in our own companies, I see a big difference between the number of women below the age of 35 who are with us and above the age of 35. And I think this is a little bit relating to our joint family system and its expectations. The younger lot are mostly now in nuclear. Husband, wife, their own kids. They are able to come. There are no pressures coming from in-laws or whoever it may be. And there's enough benefit to the joint family system. But for the older lot, those pressures, staying in the same houses, I think makes a big difference.
Yes, and that is a reality that we need to contend with. But Mallika, to the point that Sanjiv just made there in terms of predictability of policy, but also how CEOs are at this point in time making business decisions based on what's happening outside.
So I'll go back to your point on business decisions with respect to technology. I think for some of us, it's important. If you aspire to build a global business, an Indian company aspires to build a global business, I think the way you transfer technology is very critical. We want to do technology agreements that will strengthen us for the future, not make us captive to somebody else for the future. So if we can structure our technology agreements in a manner that, you know, Dr. Jaishankar was talking about, think in India, that gives us a head start, but makes us build on it, build competitive advantage, and think in India. I think that's the kind of technology transfer that we are aiming to do if we have international aspirations. I'm also, but very tempted to comment on what Sanjiv said about nuclear families, younger women versus older women.
Clearly, we need a whole section on this issue.
Yeah, he was just lobbing it there, so I have to respond. I cannot go and let it go unanswered. I think a lot of the younger women, and I don't say this because my daughter is in this crowd, so you should just ignore that comment, Lakshmi, but to say that they are depending on their parents to get to work. And I think that has not changed. Nuclear family or this thing. And I can tell you, I'm called to do duty very often. So that hasn't changed yet.
Yeah, well, you're hearing it from a grandmother, and I think we absolutely need to do much more in putting a formal care economy in place, whether it's child care or geriatric care, because the burden of both fall on the women. But let's talk about size. And, you know, Mr. Kant is, of course, often pushed for Indian industry to build world-class, but also world-size companies. TV Narendran, what gets in the way of the size aspiration, and what can we do now to fix that over the next 25 years?
You know, if you look at one of the reasons why many Indian companies, including us, went overseas 15 years back is we couldn't grow fast enough in India. You know, acquiring land, setting up a new plant. It took us 10 years to start a new greenfield site, right? And cost of capital is high, so the cost of time is high. I think that's changing now with the ease of doing business, the federal structure, the competition between the states, the cost of doing business. All this is bringing a lot of positive competition. I think the point what Mr. Amitabh Kant said is right. The center's done a lot of stuff. States vary in execution, and it's not just the states. Ultimately, if you're setting up manufacturing, it's the local district and the local issues which really delay you. So I think that's changing, and so you can build scale in India, and we should build scale in India, because unlike, you know, when we compare with many East Asian economies which grew through exports, they didn't have a choice. In India, you can build scale with the Indian market in mind, and I think many Indian companies are doing that. So today, many companies, including us, are at global scale even for the domestic market. We may be global scale globally, but even for the size that we are producing, as Tata Steel in India, we are producing more steel than most countries in the world, right? So you are able to build scale in India, and I think that's great, that's important, that helps drive competitiveness. There's a lot of competitiveness we drive inside the factory gates. There's a lot of competitiveness we need to get from outside the factory gates. That's where infrastructure, all that makes a big difference. And I just go back to one point which was made earlier. The reason why services exports took off is you didn't have to navigate Indian roads, Indian ports, all that stuff. You had a good telecom infrastructure and you could connect with anywhere in the world. So if you build that, and logistics cost in India is 14-15%, which should be 8% or whatever, and GST helps. So all this helps build competitiveness so that the competitiveness that you build inside the factory gates are not diluted as you step outside the factory gates.
So many of these structural changes have, in a sense, created the platform, created the framework for us to finally, Mr. Kant, break out of that 15-16% share of GDP, manufacturing to GDP that we've been stuck in, the aspiration of getting to 20% plus, closer to 25%. Are we at that inflection point today?
I think we are, Shereen, because the kind of structural reforms that the economy has carried out. I mean, I think one of the major flaws was that we had cascading level of taxation. So GST is, eliminated about 28 different taxes. Look at, you didn't have a bankruptcy code. So bringing in insolvency and bankruptcy code has been transformational. Similarly, I think RERA has been huge, and bringing down the corporate tax. Many people forget this. The strong balance sheet that many companies are demonstrating today is a function of the fact that you did away with 1,50,000 crores. I mean, imagine this, to bring our tax rates to international levels. And I think we've actually, the government has now challenged the private sector.
Yes, and
these kind of structural reforms would have taken decades what India did during the COVID period. So, and look at the kind of infrastructure we've built. Look at this. We built 30 million houses, which is like building one Australia. We built 110 million toilets, which is like building one Brazil. We built about 243 million water pipe connections, like building one Germany. That's the kind of scale and size of what India has done in the last 4 or 5 years.
So, the challenge has been thrown back to the private sector. Sanjiv, Bajaj, let's address this issue. Very often at debates like this, it boils down to what has the government done, what more does the government need to do. But let's address the private sector issue. Because to be fair to Mr. Kant, the government has actually been front-loading capex. It is government capex that has driven the infrastructure development so far. There's been a lot of talk about private sector appetite, private sector confidence, yet we're not seeing it being realized in fresh private sector investment. Why is that the case?
See, firstly, we all fully agree and accept that the government infrastructure program is on steroids. And I think that's saved our economy the last few years. No doubt about that. We have to also keep in mind that expectation on return on capital for the government is slightly different and longer than
Fair point.
the private
Fair point.
sector.
That point is also taken.
And I think that is this, and one must understand and respect that.
Yeah.
No private sector person is going to let go an business opportunity when it is ripe for the picking. We still live in a very uncertain world, but we are starting to see change. We saw cement, construction, housing grow. We're seeing capital equipment manufacturers see their orders grow, which means you're going to see the next set of sectors. On average, capacity utilization is right now 74 to 76%. This is the last CI survey we had done a few months ago. So we are headed towards that direction. I think the pause that the Fed is indicating, which means interest rates hopefully have peaked, is also welcome. The pragmatism that we have seen with RBI over the last 3 years in India, I don't see this with any other central bank in the world. So we have a lot of positives. We just need a little bit of patience.
The government's patience clearly seems to be running out if I look at what the expressions Mr. Kant is making there. But Mallika, Srinivasan, let's address that issue with you. And I take on board the points that Sanjiv is making, that look, at the end of the day, you have to chase demand and you cannot always chase growth. You also need to factor in what is happening as far as return on investment is concerned. You're answerable to your shareholders at the end of the day. If capacity utilization across... And banks, fair enough. If capacity utilization at this point in time is about 70-odd%, irrespective of the corporate tax cut that the government has put on the table, it probably will take longer for Indian industry to set up fresh capacity.
Well, that is completely driven by the growth rate that we are seeing. And I think it's all about if the economy grows, yes. We are happy to invest. We will certainly look. I endorse what Sanjiv was saying about we're not as patient in terms of capital and returns. We'll certainly set up capacity. I think that is not the problem. The problem is that we must grow. This economy needs to grow at 7 to 8% if we really have to keep that tempo going.
And on the growth issue, and I think that's an important point that you bring up in the book, Mr. Kant. Let me get Mallika to comment on that, and I'll get Naina and you to get in on that as well. You know, while headlines and sound bites make for great television and make for great print headlines, but at the end of the day, what we often forget is the large gap on per capita. And if India has to grow, we need to bridge that per capita gap as well. Now, you know, in terms of prescription, both government and private sector, to Mallika's point, we'll set up capacity, Sanjeev's point, we'll set up fresh capacity if we have the demand visibility. Now, you know, where do you believe things currently stand as far as being able to do more to bridge per capita? The 10% aspiration is on the table, but we're still not anywhere close to it.
So, Shereen, you know, there were two routes available before the government. One is to adopt an infrastructure route, you know, to spend more and more on capex. The other is to put a lot of money in the hands of the consumer. That can be a quick fix, but it will not give you long-term results. The better course, to my mind, is to take a policy framework which will drive capex expenditure. It will take a little time because infrastructure build-up takes time, but in the long run, it does a lot of good. So I think we are accelerating the pace of growth now, and you will see more and more demand growing in tier 2, tier 3 cities and then on to rural areas. I think that is demonstrated by growing demand for Mallika's tractors. You know, her tractors are all booming.
Yes, the tractor business is doing well, and I think you know, your point on stimulating economy by way of infrastructure development as opposed to cash transfer, we've seen the perils of that at this point in time play out across the world.
The point I'm making is that India has done also very well on cash transfers. I mean, during the COVID period, we did cash transfers to 800 million people directly into the bank account. And we also must understand that India has built up a very unique system. You know, when you do payments, you build digital identity, you put banks, you've linked banks to Aadhaar and to mobile numbers. Look at the number of startups who are doing cashless credit. And then you have a number of new startups like Zerodha, Upstock, etc. You know, controlling 30% of the stock market with cashless, paperless. Then you have new insurance companies like Digit and Acco giving you insurance policies in 2 minutes, 3 minutes, cashless, paperless. A complete transformation. Nowhere in the world is this happening, what is happening in India.
Yeah, you know, let's address those two big opportunities that Mr. Kant has also highlighted in the book, Naina. Digitization, where he does believe that we can leapfrog the world, and in many ways, whether it's the UPI, etc., we have shown a lot of promise there. And the other is decarbonization, because let's be very clear, going back again to the growth models of the past, those models are not workable. We are looking at more sustainable, more inclusive growth models which will work for us. On both those opportunities, decarbonization specifically from an India context and digitization, the promise that it holds.
So I think digitization, we've heard the theme across this conversation, that we've seen it, of course, with UPI and the cashless transfer system, but it's there in every industry. And dare I say, COVID helped very significantly in terms of making sure that people used digital infrastructure to transform their businesses, because we had to. So it did push that forward, and I think Amitabh is at the forefront of some of that messaging of pushing the digital India piece. And I think for us, whether it's from innovation or our ability to transform businesses by using that digital infrastructure in whichever way we choose to, is workable. I would just add that a sector which maybe has not seen enough attention in terms of digitalization is agriculture. And it comes back to the financial inclusion bit, because if we are to see that 7.5%, 8%, which Mallika rightly points out is where we want to be, that it's not enough for manufacturing with its 15% or the service sector to provide for it. It is for where a lot of India resides, which is in agriculture, to use these same innovations to look at that digitalization. And I'll add that on the whole piece of decarbonization, which is challenging, and I think India is right to say, hey, the West has done what it had to, and we are not going to conform because the West requires us to, but we have our own model.
Yeah.
And it's anecdotal, but a company I know well because I sit on the board, UPL, used R&D from the PUSA Institute to have a fungicide which can actually destroy the stubble, destroy as in 3 weeks the stubble becomes manured, but the same rice stubble which we otherwise burn.
Yeah.
What happened there was through a carbon structure, finance, innovation therein, that product is made available free to farmers. So you've decarbonized the environment by not polluting it by burning stubble. You've created a financial structure, which was the innovation, and you've made at the R&D between the PUSA Institute,
right,
government R&D, into the corporate sector to take this forward. I think these collaborations are what, it's not going to be about government dictating decarbonization or Narendran trying to get steel to decarbonize. I mean, these things are not going to happen overnight. But when we collaborate at the edges and we're able to deliver, and finance will drive decarbonization, India has to access global carbon credits, which are being made available. The West cheats on it, but they are being forced to give that money to countries like ours to transform. We must grab it with both hands and use it in a way that delivers the right technologies, the right structures back to us as we look to transform, but not to be dictated to, as we transform from within.
Sure. Mallika?
Yes, I want to add to what was talked about digital, the opportunities because of our digital capabilities. And Amitabh also talked about global value chains. In his book, I think this is an area, digitally delivered services is the fastest growing component of trade. And 85% of digitally delivered services is done from developed countries. But you look a little bit below, India does have some salience. So I think there's a great opportunity there to use our tech stack to participate more actively in digitally delivered services. The other point I want to make is, Amitabh referred to tractors. And perhaps I'll pick up from there to talk about one aspect, perhaps, that we could have talked about in your book. You talked very nicely about defining Atmanirbhar, to say it's not internal looking, but it's actually to develop more competence, capability, and competitiveness. And I think one good example of that would be to really take off the title stories to talk in a larger context about agriculture. Dr. Jaishankar talked about developing our own models for growth, and agriculture, what we've been able to do as a nation, is an outstanding example of how we can develop our own model, given small farms that we have, to feed 1.4 billion people, with only 18% of the world population, with much less in terms of land, and only 4% of the water resources of the world.
Absolutely.
So I think an important aspect of our future development would be to say, where's our Green Revolution 2.0? How do we really address the issues? Because if that pulls us down, the whole economy is going to get pulled down. So with our ambitious growth plans, how can we address that? How can we look at issues of technology that you referred to in agriculture, soil conservation, water conservation, optimization of inputs, and of course green. There's plenty of opportunity for agriculture to play a role in decarbonizing.
Well, thank you very much. I think that pretty much addresses the issue that I think Mr. Jaishankar was talking about, that when we talk about made in India, we're not just looking at it primarily from a manufacturing perspective or a manufacturing lens. We're really looking at it from a strategic perspective. What are the imperatives that we need to put in place to ensure that we prioritize our national objectives, but at the same time we look at how we become much more a part of the global supply chain. Mr. Kant, I'm going to get each one of you to leave us with one priority that you intend to focus on as the private sector, and one ask of the government. TV Narendran, for the next 25 years, the number one priority that you have at Tata Steel that you would like to focus on, and the number one ask from the government.
I would say two things we'll focus on. One is technology and two is green. I think sustainability and digital are very important. It's an existential issue for the steel industry. Ask of the government, I think we need to do a lot more on skilling. I think that's, I guess over the last 75 years, we focus more on education than on skills. And I think that's an area which we need to recalibrate. It's a social issue as well, not just a government issue. I think private sector also needs to do a lot there. But I think that's an important part of the next 25 years.
Mallika, Srinivasan.
For us, it is to focus on R&D, innovation, new products for global markets. And the ask of the government is, please eliminate any subsidies that are left as far as the farm equipment is concerned.
Eliminate any subsidies that are left. That should be
for
music
farm
to
equipment
your ears, Mr. Kant. That's wonderful to hear from you. Sanjiv?
So my NBFC brings about 4 million Indians every year into the formal financial system, taking them away from the local money lender. I believe inclusion is not only a responsibility, it's a huge opportunity, and that's where we are going to focus on significantly going ahead. Ask from the government, to the point even that Amitabh ji made, business eventually happens in the states. So we need that alignment between center and the states, whether it is by collaboration or by taking them over, whichever way they want to.
Well, Mr. Jaishankar has left the room. You could have left that idea with him, but then I guess.
Well, one of the asks which we didn't touch on, and we had the experts sitting right here, is tourism and a service sector which brings jobs. So let's look at job-creating sectors which we've ignored, even if they aren't quite in the manufacturing space, but they bring with jobs a whole bunch of subsidiary industries which are critical and ones which are natural for us. And that whole soft power of India, our art, our culture, yoga, Bollywood, I mean, you name it. These are global brands already. Have we capitalized enough on it? And that is brand India, which, Amitabh, I hope that you don't forget the role you've played there and take us forward in all of that. Asks, I think, transformation of the energy sector. It is important in terms of the decarbonizing, and we do well. We're doing very well with our renewables strategy. However, we have a huge challenge ahead of us in terms of the status of our discoms, and if we don't address this elephant in the room, we're going to be fried one way or other. To go back to, someone mentioned you were very good at grilling people, so we're going to be truly barbecued if we don't sort the power sector out.
That again has been a legacy issue, and we're still waiting for a resolution of some kind on that front. Mr. Kant, your ask of the private sector and your priority from government.
So my ask from the private sector is that going green and decarbonizing, to my mind, is the biggest commercial opportunity which India has to technologically leapfrog. And my ask from all governments, including state governments, is that no form should be more than half a page. No rule should be more than 1 page. No law should be more than 2 pages.
Can you do something about Gazette notifications so that people can actually understand what those Gazette notifications are? It takes us half a day to figure them out as well. Can you change that also, Mr. Kant? But I want to. Everybody here talked about.
There should be no human interaction with any government officer.
No human interaction with any government officer.
Go digital. Everything should be digital.
Okay, so let me ask you this. It might be a little bit of an unfair question, but you've been part of Make in India, obviously. You've been part of Startup India. You've been part of Incredible India. You've been part of God's own country. Which has been the most fun? Which has been the most exciting?
I've enjoyed them all, but I think the one which has had a massive, which has had the biggest impact to my mind at the central level was Startup India. I mean, the impact it has had is unparalleled in terms of young entrepreneurship, in terms of innovation, in terms of disruption. It's unparalleled. At a state level, Kerala's...
I think you need to just switch your mic, sir. Yeah.
So at the central level, Startup India's impact in terms of innovation, disruption, technology, young entrepreneurship, mind-boggling impact. I mean,
going to be in the next 25 years? I don't know where you perhaps don't have visibility on where you would be, but you have visibility on what you would like to do.
Well, I'll be trying to improve my golfing handicap.
Ladies and gentlemen, Amitabh, Kant, Sanjiv, Bajaj, Mallika, Srinivasan, and TV Narendran. Many thanks for joining us.
Let me take this opportunity to thank, because Mallika has come all the way from Chennai, TV has come all the way from Jamshedpur, Sanjiv has come all the way from Mumbai, only Nana has come from near close to Gurgaon, from Mumbai. But I really want to thank all the panelists, but there are two people I forgot to thank while doing the welcoming. Number one was my editor, Yamini. I don't know whether Yamini is here. She was...